Lara Logan, 60 Minutes war correspondent. I'll tell you, when I first got back from Iraq back in the summer of 2006, I took my first broadcasting full-time job here in Montana at the CBS TV station in Billings at KTVQ, part of the Montana Television Network. And, you know, we'd be working in the newsroom, getting ready, slamming everything through for the 5:30 newscast and everything like that. But when the CBS Evening News came on, if usually it would just be kind of background noise. You'd kind of be listening to see if there was any stories you missed or whatever, but you'd keep working. If Lara Logan came on the screen and started telling one of her stories and reported the news that she was reporting for that day, the newsroom would come to a halt and you would watch the screen. Because we all have our complaints about the mainstream media and the mainstream news media in this day and age, but Lara Logan is one of the best you'll find in the business. She's coming to Montana. She's speaking at Rocky Mountain College tonight for the presidential lecture series, but she joins us right now, right here on Montana Talks. Lara Logan, it's an honor to have you on the show this morning.
Wow, thank you so much, Aaron. That was very kind of you.
Well, it's true. In fact, I saw a Facebook post from Monty Wallace, the former general manager of the of KTVQ, that same CBS affiliate, and he said basically the exact same thing, that you are one of the best you will find. You do reporting the way it should be done. So I think I just missed you. About 10 years ago, I was at Combat Outpost Wilderness, Afghanistan, and
yes.
I showed up about a week after you were there.
Sorry about that. I've heard complaints from a few other journalists about having to follow me on an embed.
Yeah, I just missed you by a week. Well, I was actually there. I was National Guard at the time, so I was there on one of the embedded training teams that you.
Oh, wow.
That you were actually reporting on the week prior, and so yeah, you did that Hornet's Nest piece on 60 Minutes that actually aired the Sunday night before I flew into Cop Wilderness, I believe. But
wow.
Well, what's your talk going to be about tonight at Rocky Mountain College? What are you going to focus on?
Well, you know, I never plan these things out in the sense that I don't have a written speech that I then, stand up and deliver. What I do is I think about it a lot. I'm absorbing what's going on around me, and I like when I get to a place to speak to people here and get a sense of what they're interested in and who they are. Sometimes you step out on stage and there's 1,000 people and they're all much older, or I like when I talk to people to speak to the audience that's there, that's gathered, and that's assembled, and so it's pretty much obvious that everywhere you go these days, people want to talk about the media and the state of the media, and there are always issues that are in the news that come up, especially with my background. So the obvious topics are what's happening with media and media bias. And then, of course, there's the impeachment hearings and the stories that play directly into that subject. And I also just spent a few months, actually I've spent a longer than that, covering the southwest border, and I just came back from a week in Mexico. So I want to talk about that because it's so significant, and the work that we've been doing, I think, is pretty fascinating. So that will definitely come up. But I'm going to be gathering as I go throughout the day. I'm going up to the university. I'm going to be speaking to students there, and every step along the way, it is actually well thought out and structured and planned. It's just not done in the conventional way.
Lara Logan, you've now shifted from being a foreign war correspondent, I feel like, to covering the war on our southern border. Would you describe it that way, or talk about your work on our southern border?
You could describe it that way. What I find so interesting about the southern border is that we do a very good job of telling one story, which is the story of people who are, desperately seeking a better life, who make this terribly difficult and dangerous journey, and how much they struggle and suffer along the way. And then, of course, there's a lot of political reporting about, how they should be treated, and so on. But what we don't do is report on any other part of the story. And that is pretty striking to me. And it's not like it never happens. I mean, if you search hard enough for it, you can find a documentary on something like narco cultura, right, which is the culture around the narco cartels in Mexico. And you can find other, good productions that have been made, but you don't have this constant drumbeat of the same story that's on all of the networks, that's online, that's in all of the newspapers, that basically dominates, and consumes most of the reporting on this, the southwest border. And I'm always interested in understanding the full context, right? I mean, I want to understand both as a person and as a professional, as a journalist, how can I begin to report on the southwest border if I don't understand what's really happening? So it's not that the story of people struggling for a better life is not real and that it's not true. It is. It's very valid. It's just that it overshadows. We allow it, and perhaps by design, we make sure that it overshadows all of the other aspects to the story, some of which are absolutely fundamental to understanding what is really going on. So, and that would be, to me, based on my reporting, is that the transformation of the cartels in Mexico is really the most critical starting point to begin to understand what is happening on the southwest border and how to address it, how to deal with it. And also for people to understand that what happens on the southwest border isn't just a border problem. It isn't just about Texans or people in Arizona. It reaches into every town and city across the United States, and it affects every single person in this country. And if you fail to acknowledge the transformation of the cartels, which have become the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, who operate globally and whose reach goes way beyond narcotics. They're not just drug traffickers anymore. These are organizations that deal in money laundering, in sex trafficking, in human trafficking. They are involved in the very lucrative stealing of oil in Mexico. They're avocado lords now. So when you're out there buying your avocado toast, which is on almost every hip menu in America, you are potentially contributing to the well-being and the funding of the cartels. And when you look at the scale and the level of violence that is perpetrated in pursuit of profit by these organizations, then you start to see a very different set of facts emerging from the southern border. And perhaps most importantly to me, in a personal sense, is that we're complicit in the trafficking and sex trafficking of human beings. And, by the way, slave trafficking.
Lara Logan, of course, the famed overseas war correspondent for 60 Minutes, and now I think she teamed up with Sinclair Broadcasting, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct, Lara Logan? You're teaming up with Sinclair now?
Well, I did a 3-month special assignment with Sinclair, but it's ironic, actually, because in going after me and trying to smear me and target me, a number of journalists, reported on that as if I was now, tied to Sinclair for life. The right wing gets their darling, I think, was one of the headlines. And, of course, the press release said it was a 3-month special assignment, but journalists chose to ignore that.
Well, we want to talk more about the bias in the media that's out there right now, because, in fact, I actually played on this show back in July. I played an excerpt from your conversation with Mike Ridlin. I think Mike's a Navy SEAL who's got his Mic Drop podcast, and
yes.
I loved what you had to say on there. And, in fact, it was fun listening to the extended clip as well, just sitting around
thank you.
BSing with a Navy SEAL.
Mike is awesome, I have to say. And Mike is awesome, and Mic Drop is becoming huge, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah. We were talking about, so you did this big special on our southern border, and you're not just taking the one-sided view of this. You're actually looking at the drug problem, at the narco-terrorists, at the cartels, at the sex trafficking and the human trafficking that's also taking place on our southern border. And well, that probably ties in with our media bias conversation in a few more minutes, because, of course, you're straying from the narrative. You're not telling the only story that you're supposed to be telling. But we know that in Montana, meth is one of our biggest problems. We had a 400% increase in meth violations from 2010 to 2014, and we know it's all coming from the drug cartels in Mexico. So this is a very pertinent conversation for those of us here in Montana.
Well, I can tell you that meth worldwide is all coming from the Mexican drug cartels, right? And even calling them a drug cartel gives them a free pass on all the other terrible things that they do. And it also doesn't help people understand how powerful these organizations are. The Sinaloa cartel today operates in more than 50 countries. Cartel Jalisco New Generation, CJNG, they're in more than 40 countries across the world. So if you're buying meth in New York City or Montana or Brazil or in Africa or in Moscow or somewhere in Europe, you're buying it from the Mexican cartel. And that's the same for cocaine. It's the same for many other drugs, and increasingly fentanyl. And, you know, I was, which is, people probably know, is much more powerful even than heroin, like 30 times more powerful and more deadly. So I was talking to some of the DEA guys off the, you know, just chatting to them around the scenes of interviews and things like that, and just asked them, you know, casually, what is the thing that bothers you the most? And many of them said, actually, that the fact that Mexico has taken meth production to an entirely new level. Like the example was, if you used to pick up, you know, if you used to pick up like 1 kg of meth, now you're picking up literally like 600 kgs because they've created these super labs across Mexico. They control the production, they control the distribution, they control the price. And there is not a street gang in America or a drug dealer who is selling meth that doesn't owe something to the cartel, right? Because without the cartel, they have no product. And that applies across the board. Even, you know, the Chinese were originally responsible for bringing fentanyl into the U.S., and even now their role in that is fading away as the Mexicans take over that. And so it's, you know, if meth is something that affects you here in Montana, as I understand it, brace yourselves, because they are expecting like 200, 300, 400, 500% increases of meth being available and used across the U.S.
And yet you're doing the job, and you're doing the job journalists should be doing. You're getting the facts. You're telling these important stories that really, in many instances, are life and death stories. We're seeing the foster system being overwhelmed in Montana, and it's all going back to meth. We're seeing we saw double-digit increases in violent crimes, homicides, rapes, you name it.
What about mental illness?
Yeah.
What about the links between mental illness and drug use? I love how we have this whole conversation about drugs. You know, marijuana, for example. And I've seen people personally in my life struggle with depression and other related, you know, mental issues because of drug use. And yet we want to talk about legalization, but we don't want to talk about any of the consequences. And I'm not taking a position for or against it. You know, that's not really the issue. The issue for me is that my kids are growing up in a world where everywhere they turn, people are talking about drugs. Literally, there's a game about kindergartners, right, killing each other, which I don't really understand in the first place. But in this game, casually, 2 of these kids leave the cafeteria where the killing is taking place and to go and have a smoke. And one asks for a cigarette, and the other one gives them something, says, oh, this is much better than a cigarette. And they sit there getting high. This is in a video game, okay, about kindergartners.
Wow.
That has to concern every parent, that your kids are growing up in a world where the narrative on drugs has changed, which is fine, but the narrative is now just as dishonest as it may have been before.
Why do you think so many journalists...
There are consequences to these things.
Why do you think so many journalists, and we're talking with Lara Logan, the famed CBS 60 Minutes foreign correspondent, war correspondent, why do you think so many journalists are afraid or refuse to tell these stories? And then not only that, but so many in the mainstream media will attack real journalists like you for telling these stories?
Well, from my personal experience is that every newsroom I ever worked in the U.S., and in fact, even in South Africa where I grew up, you know, was completely and utterly dominated by liberals. And that in itself is not a problem. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. And I smile to myself when people talk about the backlash against me for saying that most journalists in the U.S. are on the left, because there was no backlash. You didn't see lines of journalists stepping forward, raising their hands, saying, wait a minute, that's not true. I'm not on the left. I'm not liberal. You know, you just didn't see that happening because It's just a reality that, the universities and journalist programs in academia are dominated by liberals and liberal thinking and on the left, and that creates fertile ground for the propagandists and political operatives to be successful, if you like. And it doesn't help when you have one political ideology dominating your academic institutions. It dominates your civil rights organizations, your advocacy groups, your consumer groups, your PR firms in Washington. And so what disturbs me is not, the ideology in itself. That's one conversation. What I've been very clear about is that I'm not a stooge of the left or of the right. Nobody owns me. I just want to be very, very clear about that. It doesn't matter what you read. It doesn't matter how they try to smear me. The fact is, nobody owns me. What I care about is the process of independent and honest journalism, protecting ourselves from our own bias, because we all have bias. And to say we don't make subjective decisions in our work and that we have no bias is just not realistic and not honest, in my view. And I don't know what's happened recently since Trump was elected. I just don't understand it, because what I see is that the basic standards of journalism have gone out the window. They've just been completely and utterly trashed. And we don't seem to have to apply the same standard from one person to the next, depending on what their political position is. I had a journalist ask me, a young student, ask me once, about this false equivalency, right? That we get told we have to give both sides the story. But if one side is completely false and based on complete lies, and the other side is backed by absolute scientific evidence, then why should we give them, equal time in the story? And I said, well, give me your example. And she used climate as the example. And I said, well, what do geologists say about climate change, right? As an example, you say there's no science on the one side and complete and absolute science on the other side. What do geologists say? Well, they say that the Earth's been warming and cooling every 200 years for billions of years. And they can measure this down to the tiniest little micromillimeter in rocks, right? And then on the other side, you have temperature. How long have temperature records been kept? Just over 100 years? Somewhere around there. How accurate are they? They're not very accurate. So how absolute is that science? When journalists say it's the hottest, summer on record, what they don't mention there is that we've only been keeping records for literally a nanosecond. And I have to say this, I'm not a climate denier. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that you can't have an honest conversation if you're pretending that one side is completely settled and scientifically there's no doubt and nothing will prove and nothing is ever going to change, and the other side has zero basis. That is not true. That has happened because of this system of punishment within the public forum, both on social media and in the media itself. It's happened because political propaganda organizations that are extremely well funded are making sure that they silence any conversation. Political leaders are doing the same.
Exactly. You're not even allowed to ask questions. Yeah, you can't even ask certain questions anymore, that's for sure. Lara Logan, we've got less than a minute to go. She speaks tonight at Rocky Mountain College, 6 p.m. This has just been fascinating. With the 30 seconds or so we have left, you've put your own life on the line to share these important stories. What do you want to tell folks across Montana?
I want to tell them that if you believe in independent and honest journalism, stand up against the propagandists and the political operatives. Don't buy into this culture of trial by media, where people don't have any chance to defend themselves, where people get defamed all the time. Anybody can be targeted. Anybody. It happens all the time, and it's easy to recognize patterns in how this is done. I mean, you can see some of the patterns when you look at Russia and Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
You can definitely see some of those patterns emerging.